In November 2018, Jacqueline Smith went out with her husband to celebrate the birthday of her husband's daughter, Valeria. They celebrated, had fun, and took photos. After the party ended, they left the venue around midnight. No one could have predicted what would happen next. That happy night turned into a terrifying nightmare. Today's story is a unique tale of deceit and betrayal, proof that everything around us might have two faces. Before we dive into the details, don't forget to give this video a like. Now let's get started with today's case. Our story takes us to Baltimore, Maryland. Baltimore is a large city with people from various backgrounds and social classes. In some areas, the streets are filled with beggars and homeless people. Some are harmless, while others can be intimidating. On December 1st, 2018, at approximately 12:30 a.m., a man named Keith Smith, 52 years old, called emergency services in a hysterical state. He claimed he was sitting in his car with his wife, Jacqueline, when a homeless man attacked and stabbed her. Keith told the dispatcher that Jacqueline needed urgent help. Valeria, his daughter, was sitting in the back seat and witnessed the horrifying assault on her stepmother. But why would a homeless man do something like this? What could have been his motive? Jacqueline was rushed to the nearest hospital, but her condition was critical. She had been stabbed 5 times. Tragically, the doctors couldn't save her, and she passed away shortly after arriving at the hospital. At that time, investigators went to the hospital and started questioning Keith, Jacqueline's husband, and his daughter Valeria. They wanted to understand exactly what had happened. Keith explained that they were celebrating Valeria's 28th birthday, and after leaving the venue, they were heading to Valeria's house to drop her off. Just a few streets away from her home, Jacqueline saw a struggling woman standing in the street holding a sign that read, "Please help me feed my baby." Jacqueline asked Keith to stop the car so she could help the woman and give her some money. Unfortunately, this turned out to be a fatal mistake. Keith stopped the car and Jacqueline rolled down her window to hand the woman $10. But as soon as Jacqueline handed over the money, a homeless man appeared out of nowhere. He approached Jacqueline's window, supposedly to thank her. However, in a split second, the man pulled out a knife, stabbed her, snatched the gold chain from around her neck, and grabbed her purse from her lap. The 2 homeless individuals quickly ran off. According to Keith, it all happened so fast that he could barely comprehend what was going on. He provided the police with descriptions of the 2 assailants. In the days following the attack, Keith and Valeria appeared in multiple media outlets, warning people about the dangers of trusting strangers on the street. They emphasized that not everyone who looks helpless and needy truly is. At this point, investigators wanted to learn more about Jacqueline and determine whether this was just a random crime or a premeditated act. They discovered that Jacqueline was born on July 4th, 1964, making her 54 years old. She was a highly successful electrical engineer working for the Department of Defense in Maryland. According to her mother, Jacqueline loved music and poetry and was well liked by everyone who knew her. She had 2 grown children from a previous marriage and married Keith Smith in 2014. Jacqueline was also known for her generosity and her passion for helping others. She was deeply religious, and she and Keith regularly attended church. In short, Jacqueline didn't have any enemies, and her life seemed to be going smoothly. This made it seem like the crime was just a random act of violence. But to uncover the truth, you can't rely solely on appearances. In the days following the crime, Keith and Valeria continued to appear in the media, recounting what had happened and warning people about the dangers of trusting street beggars. They stressed that such individuals could pose serious risks, urging everyone to be cautious. Due to what happened to Jacqueline, the police issued a statement to residents in the area, warning them to be wary of homeless people and beggars on the streets. Naturally, people became extremely fearful of the homeless population. In fact, the story of Jacqueline's murder gained nationwide attention. Even Oprah Winfrey heard about it, and she was deeply affected. Oprah posted about the incident on her page, warning people to be cautious of the homeless. At that time, the police were searching everywhere for the 2 homeless individuals, worried they might commit another crime. They issued a bulletin with the descriptions provided by Keith and Valeria. The woman was described as being of African descent, in her 20s, of average build, approximately 155 centimeters tall, wearing a long brown coat and possibly carrying a baby. The man was also of African descent, in his 30s, of average height and build, wearing a black jacket and sporting a beard. On the night of the crime, investigators interviewed Valeria and Keith, gathering details about where the incident occurred. The police went to the scene, photographed it, and thoroughly searched the area. However, they didn't find any evidence or clues to confirm a crime had taken place there. The next day, around 10 a.m., they conducted another search of the area in daylight, hoping for better visibility and useful leads. They canvassed the entire neighborhood, speaking to nearby residents, but unfortunately, no one had seen or heard anything suspicious that night. Additionally, the investigators couldn't pinpoint the exact spot where Keith claimed the car had stopped to hand money to the beggars. A search for the murder weapon, a knife, also came up empty. Interestingly, the investigation team noted that the street where Keith and Jacqueline supposedly stopped was very quiet with little traffic. Most of the houses on that street were vacant, making it highly unlikely that beggars would frequent such an area. Homeless people typically don't choose deserted streets to beg for money, which raised questions about why those two individuals would be there. At that point, the investigators sent Keith and Jacqueline's Audi to the forensic lab. Upon examination, fingerprints were found on the passenger side of the car, where Jacqueline had been seated. However, the prints belonged to Keith, the car owner, which was entirely expected. No unusual fingerprints were found either inside or outside the vehicle. Inside the car, investigators discovered a pair of black gloves and another pair of yellow rubber gloves on the back seat. They also found acrylic nails in the back seat, which matched the type of nails Valeria used. There was no DNA evidence or unidentified fingerprints in the car, making it extremely difficult for the investigators to identify the attackers. The police then sought assistance from a team specializing in homeless outreach, as these individuals frequently interact with homeless people and might provide leads. The team was given the descriptions of the two suspects based on Keith and Valeria's accounts. However, despite their efforts, they couldn't find anyone matching the descriptions. At this point, the investigators began to suspect something was wrong with Keith and Valeria's story, especially the part about the route they took and the street where they stopped. The street in question wasn't a logical place to find beggars. To confirm whether Keith had actually taken the route he claimed, the FBI was called in to retrieve data from the Audi's onboard computer to track their movements using the car's GPS. Unfortunately, this effort failed and they couldn't retrieve any useful data, leading to a dead end. Next, they decided to reconstruct the timeline of events by collecting all the surveillance camera footage from the city to trace the movements of Keith's car. Starting with the birthday celebration, surveillance footage from the event hall showed that they arrived around 7:30 p.m. They celebrated Valeria's birthday and left the hall as a family at approximately 11:45 p.m. The investigators wanted to verify whether the route Keith described and confirmed by Valeria was accurate. They checked the surveillance footage along the route they claimed to have taken, including the street where they supposedly stopped, as well as the surrounding area. However, the Audi didn't appear on any of the footage during the relevant time frame. Some security cameras from The investigators then decided to track the phone signals of Keith and Valeria to trace their movements that night. Valeria's phone records revealed that they hadn't been heading toward her house as they claimed. Instead, they had traveled north to a park near the zoo where they stayed for approximately 15 minutes. Neither Valeria nor her father mentioned visiting the park during their interviews. The investigators also examined Jacqueline's stolen phone records. It turned out that her phone was last used at around 4 p.m. that day at their home. This was strange because Keith and Valeria claimed Jacqueline took her phone with her to the birthday party and that it was in her stolen purse. However, the phone's records suggested it never left the house, indicating Jacqueline went to the party without it. By now, it was clear there were many inconsistencies in Keith and Valeria's story. The police visited secondhand shops to see if anyone had sold items from Jacqueline's stolen purse, such as her gold necklace or the purse itself. However, they found no leads as none of her belongings had been sold anywhere. About a week and a half later, they discovered someone had used Jacqueline's bank card. This led them to 3 teenage boys who claimed they found the bank card inside a Michael Kors purse left at a bus station. Although the teens were initially treated as suspects, they were quickly released when investigators confirmed that the bus station was on the same street Keith and Valeria had driven down after leaving the birthday party. 3 months had passed since Jacqueline's murder, and the police had failed to find any evidence linking the crime to the supposed beggars. However, they did uncover contradictions in Keith and Valeria's statements. For instance, shortly after the incident, while still at the hospital, Keith claimed that the second beggar, a man, had approached the car and snatched Jacqueline's purse. But in a later interview, he said it was the woman who had taken the purse. Such inconsistencies cast doubt on the truth of their story. Initially, both Keith and Valeria appeared frequently in the media, warning people to be cautious of beggars and the dangers in the streets. However, over time, they stopped speaking to the press and tried to disappear from the public eye. The investigators confronted Keith with the information they had, showing that their phone records proved they didn't take the route he claimed. For the second time, Keith changed his story, saying he had gotten lost that night and was too embarrassed to admit it. He then confessed that they did go to the park where they stayed for a while, looking at the pictures they had taken at the birthday party. What was surprising was that after this interrogation, Keith went home, packed up, rented a new house in Florida, rented a car, and left the state entirely. Meanwhile, when investigators tried to question Valeria again, she refused to talk without a lawyer present. Shortly after, she too left the state and joined her father in Florida. At this point, the police were certain that Keith and Valeria were trying to escape. They decided to keep them under surveillance, including monitoring their phone activities. In February 2019, they discovered that Keith had tried to book 2 one-way tickets out of the country. His plan was to first travel to Canada and then to Cuba. However, his attempt failed because he didn't have a US passport. Investigators also noticed that Keith had searched on Google whether a passport was needed to travel to Jamaica and whether it was possible to cross into Mexico without passing through border checkpoints. They later found out that Keith had rented a car in Texas, suggesting he was heading to Mexico. At this point, arrest warrants were issued for both Keith and Valeria. When the warrants were issued, they were only about 20 minutes away from the Mexican border, clearly attempting to flee the country. However, they were apprehended in Texas on the same day the warrants were issued. The shocking revelation was that the story about the beggars being responsible for Jacqueline's murder wasn't even Keith's original plan. It turned out he had a different plan in mind. According to Keith's brother's friend, Keith had asked him for help in getting rid of his wife. Naturally, the friend refused. Allegedly, Jacqueline had told Keith she wanted a divorce, but Keith wasn't willing to let her go. Instead, he seemed to think there was a better way to separate from her, by taking out a life insurance policy in her name and making himself the sole beneficiary. He did in fact take out the policy. Only 2 days after the murder, he went to Jacqueline's workplace to collect the insurance documents and filed a claim with the insurance company. However, the police were still investigating and were suspicious of Keith's story. They asked the insurance company to withhold any payments. Keith and Valeria's fabricated story didn't sit well with many people, especially Jacqueline's mother. From the very beginning, she wasn't convinced by their story and felt it made no sense. She questioned how Jacqueline could have been sitting right next to Keith in the car, yet he didn't attempt to defend her, stop the beggar, or even drive away quickly. It made no sense that he would just sit there and watch, especially since Jacqueline wasn't stabbed once, but 5 times. Jacqueline's mother felt his reaction, or lack thereof, was completely illogical. It also became apparent that neither Jacqueline nor her family truly knew Keith well. They certainly didn't know about his criminal past. It was revealed that 20 years ago, Keith had committed 3 armed robberies at the same bank. In December 1999, he was fired from his job at a parcel delivery company because of multiple violations that added points to his driver's license, indicating a history of reckless driving. The biggest shock, however, came when it was discovered that Keith had been infected with HIV before marrying Jacqueline. At the time, he didn't even have money to support his home and was in desperate need of funds for his treatment, so he decided to rob a bank. He targeted a nearby bank that was close to a highway, which helped him escape quickly after the robbery. He entered the bank wearing a mask and armed with a gun, stole money, and exited through the back door. In the first robbery, he made away with $15,000, but that wasn't enough. After just 2 months, he repeated the same operation at the same bank, this time stealing $16,000. Again, that wasn't enough. So 5 months later, he went back to rob the same bank, but this time the police were tipped off and they had his car's description. Once they spotted his vehicle, they chased him, leading to a car crash and a subsequent arrest. Keith was sentenced to 12 years in prison but only served 6 years as he was released early. When arrested, he claimed he had spent all the money on treatment bills, but when they searched his house, they found $200,000 hidden in a black bag. Now, returning to the main case, his daughter, Valeria, was accused of being an accomplice in the crime. It was clear she was trying to cover up the crime, and as you saw, she appeared in the media, pretending to be emotional and affected. Investigators also discovered that her mental health wasn't stable as she suffered from bipolar disorder. This led to her being hospitalized in 2012. Additionally, she was addicted to a very dangerous type of drug, making her somewhat a victim of her father's influence, as he forced her to assist in the crime and cover it up. They offered her a plea deal in exchange for a confession and a reduced sentence. She agreed and admitted to being an accomplice in the crime. She also agreed to testify against her father in court. The trial began in late 2021, and in court, Valeria testified that after they celebrated her birthday, her father drove them to the park. At that time, Jacqueline was asleep in the front seat. When they reached the park, her father stopped the car, took out a knife, and stabbed Jacqueline 5 times. He then hid the knife in the woods and gave her Jacqueline's bag, telling her to get rid of it. She took the bag to the bus station and placed it there, where a group of young men took the bag and walked away. She also said that her father had been very calm and composed during the crime, but once he called the emergency services, he became hysterical. Valeria revealed that the story about the beggars was fabricated by her father, and he had forced her to participate in the staged scene. Now she decided to tell the truth because she didn't want to go to prison for something she didn't do. She also revealed that it was her who told the authorities about the life insurance policy on Jacqueline's life. Finally, Keith Smith was sentenced in December 2021 to life in prison for first-degree murder. A month later, Valeria was sentenced to 5 years in prison for being an accessory to the crime. In the end, I'd like to know your opinion on today's case. Do you think his daughter was a victim of his actions, or is she old enough and responsible for her own choices? If you've made it this far, please share your opinion in the comments.